diving into what we want to cover today, along with the way that Altura partners with CERCLOS, is CALGreen. As of July 1st, 2024, so very recently, they came out with a new mandate for California to essentially start calculating embodied carbon for new constructions and renovations, and essentially finding ways to reduce that baseline impact. To give you more details about who this is going to be impacting, so here's the intro. It's typically targeting buildings that are 100,000 square feet or larger in the commercial space, as well as schools that are 50,000 square feet or larger, and that's meant to change and expand on January 1st, 2026. So it does apply to a lot of buildings, and since it came out and since embodied carbon is such a new concept, it's a tough challenge for a lot of building owners and facility managers to understand how to exactly tackle this. And we're hoping to provide a little bit of insight as to how eTool and Altura can help out with that. And so, like I said, and like Aniki had mentioned, embodied carbon is a growing space and it has quite the impact. There's a 50-50 split when it comes to looking at the impact of embodied carbon versus operational. So it's important to look at things at a high level and look at the whole life cycle of a building. And once you understand those impacts, that's when you can start to really make an impact on reducing those, kilograms of CO2 and your carbon impacts through the operational side of things. And so Altura and eTool have been working together, as I've mentioned many times. What we do for a few clients is we help calculate the embodied carbon of, renovations and new constructions by looking at the materials being used, the equipment being installed. And since embodied carbon is a heavy upfront impact that you can't really change upon construction, it's important to act fast. It's important to understand what needs to be done before construction starts or renovation begins in order to make sure that you're doing as much as you can to reduce the carbon that's going to be emitted. And so we like to leverage eTool and take all the data from that tool and essentially create life cycle assessments tools, decarbonization roadmaps to help clients understand, here's the data, and very importantly, here's what you can do with it. Here's ways that you can reduce it, and here's the changes that's going to make through the whole life cycle of your building. And so, eTool does have a lot of capabilities. You're able to look at operational carbon in addition to the embodied carbon. And so the way that Altura likes to leverage that is just kind of take it outside of the box and help you understand the next steps when it comes to procuring all that data. So CALGreen does have different tiers of compliance and different pathways, and I want to take you through all of these, starting with the performance pathway, which is the whole building life cycle assessment. What this is essentially, reading the data, understanding what your baseline carbon impacts are before you begin your construction or renovation, and then creating a 10% reduction from that global warming impact upon creating the baseline. And so this is the case study example we're going to be showing you in a few slides. However, there are a few other pathways that I'd like to share. Another being the building reuse pathway. This one focuses instead on reusing and repurposing as many materials as you can when you're constructing a new building. And so the mandatory threshold for that is to reuse at least 45% of your structural elements upon construction. And the third pathway is the material limits pathway. This one's a little bit different. This one is actually based on a list of materials that you can use. So if you were to use these certain types of materials, that I'll show you the list shortly, you need to have in hand the Type 3 environmental product declarations that essentially let you know what is the life cycle assessment, so environmental impact, GHG emissions of all of these products. And you need to make sure to not exceed 175% of these impacts. And all these different pathways have kind of different rules. For the material limits pathway, you do need to submit a different worksheet in comparison to the performance pathway. But to give you more insight on this material limits pathway and the types of products that are included, this is what it would look like. So looking at the global warming impact, like I said, this is not to exceed 175% and to have a Type 3 EPD. ready alongside with it to submit. And so I wanted to show you what the timeline looks like. What does the process look like? And if you are an architect, a contractor, a building owner, what's your role in all of this? And so as an architect, it's important to minimize materials as much as you can and try to identify recycled or low carbon materials and start to request EPDs at that point if you're designing a building. And as a contractor, it's important to work with the architect and start to procure those EPDs in low carbon materials that can be used towards whether it's CALGreen or just trying to reduce your embodied carbon impact. As a building owner, it's pretty important just to have oversight and clear understanding of what embodied carbon is and understand what you can do to minimize it. And so a lot of the, data procurement and looking into your impacts can begin in the design phase, whereas during the permitting phase is when you would start to submit your documentation to apply and to, make sure you're within the requirements for CALGreen. And so we're going to show you a bit more about what this worksheet is, what the documentation looks like, and hopefully give you more insight into what exactly this could look like on the performance pathway for a new building. And before we go into that, we just wanted to give a little bit more insight into how is this data found? Is it reliable? What does this process look like? So as Aniki mentioned, the data in eTool is very reliable. It comes from certified groups such as EcoInvent, and they source a lot of great EPDs, like I said, that contain the life cycle assessment impacts when it comes to environmental and GHG emissions, as well as ISO certifications that they actually help support. What's really helpful in eTool that I've actually used a few times is their third-party verification. If I'm creating a new template or I'm creating a new building, it's really helpful to have a second eye on it from a reliable engineer on their staff and make sure that all the assumptions that I'm making seem in line and are correct according to the equipment that's chosen or the material that's chosen. And eTool just has a lot of capabilities when it comes to LCAs, whether it's just the embodied carbon modeling, the operational impact that you want to calculate, creating EPDs, working within ISO certifications, and just validating the data that you've created. It's wonderful, and it comes from a lot of reliable sources, which only adds to its growing database. And so just a quick refresher as to what these life cycle stages look like and how they apply to CALGreen. So CALGreen is focused on the embodied carbon impact, which means we're looking at A1 through B5 as well as C1 to D. And what's not included is the operational, which is B6 and B7 over here. And so eTool is able to calculate the product and construction. So you can calculate transport to factory, you can calculate, the labor and construction that goes into creating a building or completing a retrofit, as well as the maintenance and use. So this has been very surprising to me and especially important when you're looking at equipment, ensuring that you're choosing low global warming impact refrigerants. It can have a huge effect on your upfront embodied carbon impacts, as well as how end of life tends to affect your impacts. If you choose to recycle or just dispose of it in a landfill, what kind of difference can you make? And can you recuperate or save any upfront carbon by the way that you dispose of your materials or your equipment? And so, like I said, CALGreen does focus on these embodied carbon stages, and importantly, it only looks at structure and enclosure. It does not look at MEPs, furniture, landscaping, any of that sort. It's really just, the structure and the enclosure of the building that we focus on for this regulation. And so another thing is that typically the reference study period for CALGreen is 60 years. So that's going to be what we're going to be using for a case study on the performance pathway, is a life cycle of 60 years for an office building. And biogenic carbon is not included. So carbon that's typically found in plants and soil and biofuels is not included in the study. But what will be included, as I said, is the structural components. So roof, beams, foundation, flooring, all of that good stuff. And eTool has different ways of laying out the way that you want to look at your building. You know, they can lay it out by life cycle stage, which you can see here is really helpful. As you can see, A1 and A3, the product, transportation, and construction is quite high. And we'll dive into that a little bit further, but the way it's laid out does help you have a stronger understanding of where you need to focus your time and energy if you want to reduce that upfront carbon. And so we're going to go ahead and dive into that case study. It's not a real life case study, it's an example that we created. You know, this regulation just came out July 1st, so we went ahead and modeled an office building that is 100,000 square feet, and we wanted to essentially create a really strong baseline and get you to understand what this can potentially look like if you were to model it in eTool. So there's two different ways that you can look at it. This one over here, this graphic, lays everything out by life cycle stage, as does the graphic on the right. They both contain the exact same data and values. The main difference is that the graphic on the right contains a little bit more insight into the life cycle stages. Sorry about that. And so as you can see, when we're looking at all the different life cycle stages, the main one that jumps out is the products. There's a lot of carbon in there and the materials that are being sourced. And so what that helps us understand is, let's go ahead and shift our focus to the product stage and find ways to reduce that. Another helpful component of eTool is that you can get a stronger understanding of why exactly are we seeing so much carbon in these products. Here are the top material impacts that we're looking at. You can have all of the materials listed, ranging from the highest impact to the lowest. Our highest being the concrete blends that we're using, as well as the steel reinforcement bars. And that'll help us understand that maybe let's not focus on these plastics and metals, and let's go ahead and shift our attention to the concrete and maybe find a different blend or a different material that could be used to reduce that upfront impact. And so before we show you the results and how to model that in eTool, here's what the WS9 worksheet looks like if you were to go ahead on the performance pathway for CALGreen. As you can see, there's a lot of different fields they're asking for numbers for, which can be really overwhelming. What's helpful is that eTool will have all of those numbers for you, and we went ahead and filled it out so I can give you more insight into what that would look like based on our last model of the office building. Looking at structure versus enclosure global warming impacts, you can look at the total kilograms of CO2 at a whole building level or at each structure or enclosure level. And so on the performance pathway, the mandatory reduction is 10%. So we essentially just need to calculate what number do we need to reach to be within regulation. That number is 6.9 million carbons of CO2 in comparison to the 7.6 million. And so now that we have this number handy, we understand what our threshold is and what number we need to reach. That's when you can take that and model it in eTool. And so one last thing I forgot to mention is they do have you organize these numbers according to the life cycle stage, which we have laid out in that graphic that I previously showed you. So it was easy to just transpose those numbers into this worksheet. And so a great way to be able to model this in eTool is the application of their scenario tool and the scenario building that they have. And so as you can see here, we have quite a few scenarios that I'll walk you through. One scenario that helps you meet the requirements is finding a different blend in concrete. So essentially replacing this with a 50% blend, which is a cement additive, and it helps you achieve that 10% reduction. As you can see, we're at 6.89 million kilograms of CO2, which is right below that 6.9 that we had to achieve. Perfect. That helps us understand exactly what we need to do to help achieve those numbers. We have our next steps laid out clearly. If we want to take it a step above and maybe reach the tier 2 requirements, which is a 15% reduction, we can go ahead and take it an extra step, and we can use sustainably sourced hardwood instead of cement, which has quite a large impact. It helps you reduce by 16% in accordance to the baseline. But what's helpful with the scenario component of eTool is you can see all the scenarios outlined side by side. As you can see, this scenario is a completely separate one from this second one down here. If you want to go ahead and add multiple components to one scenario, you can have them do so instead of branching out. So this EPD steel rebar component is in addition to the concrete blend, seeing an extra 1.7% reduction, as well as creating EPD for these steel reinforcement bars. And so that's essentially what I wanted to show. I'll kind of end it there so we can get some questions, but if you do have any questions that might come up after the presentation as well, please feel free to contact us. We're happy to dive into that with you. We know it's a brand new space and it's challenging. We completely understand that. And we have a lot of helpful tools, partnering with eTool and just with the work we've done with so many clients when it comes to tackling these challenges.